Hello, I'm Karen Jernigan, and today is January the 15th, 2012. We are in the town of Arroyo Grande to interview Ernest Clement, who is a native of King City, and we're here to learn about some of the history that Ernest knows about King City. So, we're going to start with a few questions. So Ernest, are you ready for this?
Yes, I am.
I think it's going to be fun. My first question to you is, can you tell us the date that you were born and where you were born?
I was born August 12, 1925, at home in a house on San Lorenzo in King City.
San Lorenzo Avenue. Okay, let me think about that. Was it on the north side of town or the south?
Yes, it was on the north side of town. It was about a block north of Broadway.
Oh, is the house still there today?
Yes, it is.
Okay. Do you remember the number of the house?
No, I have no recollection of that.
Okay. All right, but if you drove down North San Lorenzo, would you be able to point out the house?
Yes, I could.
Oh, okay. So
Yes.
maybe we'll do that someday, and you can show us
That
what
would
it
be
is. Then we'll
interesting,
know
yes.
which one it is. Okay, and what were your parents' names?
My father was Alva Clement, and my mother was Ethel. Her maiden name was Thayer. They came from Greenfield, but they lived their whole married life in King City.
Okay. And were you their only child?
Yes, I was.
Okay, and what is your middle name?
Edward.
Ernest Edward Clement.
Right.
And do any of your names have some significance? Were you named after?
Yes, I was named after two grandfathers,
Okay.
Edward Clement and Ernest Thayer.
Ah, interesting. Okay. So, you weren't born at a hospital then?
No,
Did
I don't
your
think there was a hospital there then.
Okay. Did your mother or father tell you anything about your birth? Did a midwife come?
No,
Was it?
I
You
don't know
remember?
anything about that.
Okay. All right. And what were your parents doing in King City at that time?
My father was in a partnership with a man by the name of Bart Knox, and they had a Studebaker agency on Broadway, and they were together in that for several years.
Do you know where that was located?
Yes, it's located on the south side of Broadway between 3rd Street and Vanderhurst.
Okay.
The building is still there, but it's a grocery store now.
Okay. Was it Fairway or was it the A1 Market or?
It was Fairway.
Fairway. Okay. And that used to be a Studebaker agency.
Yes.
Okay.
In fact, I think the sidewalk still has the driveways poured into the concrete. The doors in and out were removed or remodeled, but that building is still there.
Mm-hmm. And your mother, was she a homemaker?
Yes, she never worked outside the home
Okay.
after she was married.
Now, you were telling me the story briefly about how your mother came to Greenfield. Can you go back and talk about that a little bit?
Yes, my mother was born in Madera, where her family lived for several years. And in about 1901 or 2, I think it was, they moved to Norwalk, California, where they lived for several years.
Okay.
At that time, in 1905, I think the Clark Colony, which is now called Greenfield, was being divided up, settled, and so forth. And they had bought some property in Greenfield, and they moved by horse and wagon from Norwalk to Greenfield. I think it took them about 2 or 3 weeks because horse travel was pretty slow.
Do you know how they ended up getting property in Clark Colony or how they knew about it?
I don't know the details
Know the
on
story.
that.
Okay.
The area was divided up into square blocks of either, they were 10-acre blocks, but sometimes they were contiguous so that they were multiples of 10. But I don't know how it was publicized or how they made contact. I have the feeling that my grandfather probably made the trip up first to look the situation over, but I'm not sure about that.
So what were your mother's parents' names?
Ernest and Nora Thayer.
Ernest and Nora
Right.
Thayer. So how old was your mother when that happened, that they went by horse travel?
She would have been almost 7 years old.
7 years old, okay. And she has told you about that, or you said you had a diary?
My mother remembered bits of that trip, but not much of it. But I have a little diary that my grandmother wrote as they made that trip about events that happened or places they stopped. For instance, they mentioned going over the San Marcos Pass and stopping at the Cold Springs Tavern when the road was very primitive there.
And where else did they stop?
Oh, mostly small towns along the way.
Okay.
I don't recall any particular names.
You inherited that diary through your mother?
Yes,
Okay.
it's a very crudely written. It was with a pencil on a writing tablet, and it has, as the wagon was driving along, it's not very clear. I had to make a copy of it so that I could read it.
Oh, wow. Okay. So your mother was 7 years old when she came to Greenfield.
Yes.
And did she talk to you at all about what her life was like growing up as a child in Greenfield?
Yes, there were bits of information, stories about, say, walking to school. There was one little incident that I thought was funny. She didn't think so, but she was walking to school. They were cutting across an alfalfa field, and she stepped on some kind of a snake. And neither the snake nor she was very happy about that. But they walked, I think, a long distance to school. And she had a large family, so it was a very active household.
So your mother was one of how many children?
10 of them had grown up. There were 3 children that were lost very early, either at birth or in their early years.
Okay. And then did the other 10 come to Greenfield?
Some were born after they arrived in Greenfield,
Okay.
so I don't remember how many, but
Okay.
several of them.
So your mother, where did she fit in the lineup of the Thayers?
She was, of the ones that survived, she was the third child and the first daughter.
Oh, okay. And do you know where their property was in Greenfield?
I don't remember street names. It was out on the north eastern side of town. The names of the streets I don't recall.
Okay. Okay, so your mother graduated from high school?
She didn't graduate, but she had attended the King City High School. And at one time, they had what they called a school bus. It was just a large car, I think, that drove back and forth. There was one winter when the bridge washed out because of high water, and they had to stay in town. I think they stayed in homes of people in King City for a while until the bridge was rebuilt.
Wow. So do you know what years your mother attended King City High School?
No, I don't remember.
Okay. But she moved there so it had to be, if she moved in 1905 and she was about 7, it probably would have been in the late teens then, sometime.
I think so.
Okay.
I think so, the middle to the late teens.
Okay. All right. And at what point did she meet your father?
My father's family moved to Greenfield in 1917, so it would have been after 1917, probably
Okay.
soon after that, because Greenfield was a small town, and I think everyone knew everybody else.
Well, let's talk about how your father then ended up in Greenfield.
His family originally came from, he was born in the countryside, but near a little town called Springville, in the foothills of the Sierras, not too far from Porterville.
Okay. Spring Hill?
Springville,
Springville.
right,
Near Porterville.
yes.
Okay. And what were his parents' names?
Edward and Mattie Clement,
Oh, Mattie. Mattie?
yes,
And that was John's grandmother's name.
really,
Yeah, Mattie. Okay. Edward and Mattie Clement.
right.
Okay. And so he was born in Springfield, and then how did he end up in Greenfield?
Pardon?
How did he end up in Greenfield then?
I think the family moved because of the heat in the valley. They had some property over there. I think they had an orange grove, and they were established, but I think it was the heat in the valley that they wanted to get out of.
Okay. And then they heard about Greenfield, or do you know how they chose Greenfield to come to?
No, I don't really know. I
Okay.
think somehow they made contact, and I believe they exchanged the property there for some property in Greenfield, but I don't know the details of it.
Okay. But you say that was around 1917.
Yes.
And how old was your father? Do you recall?
He would have been 20, 19 or 20.
Okay. And was it not too long after he moved to Greenfield that he met your mother?
Probably so.
Okay.
One little thing about that is that in 1918, soon after they had moved, the flu epidemic hit very hard. And I think schools closed, and there were a lot of people that were very ill with the, I don't know if they called it Spanish flu, but it was a very serious influenza epidemic, and quite a few fatalities.
And you remember your mother and father telling about that?
I remember my father telling about it because he was very seriously ill, but at home, and they tell a story about his, well, being not lucid. What do you call that? He was in a
Kind of delirious?
delirium, and not thinking rationally. They had kerosene lamps in the house, and he got up one time and he started tipping furniture over, and my grandmother had to stop him because she was afraid that the lamp would fall over and burn the house down.
Ooh.
And he was delirious for a period of time. So
Wow.
it was a serious influenza epidemic.
So do you know when your parents married?
Yes, they married in 1923.
Okay. So there was a few years there between the time your father moved and they got married. Do you know anything about those years in the early 20s?
Very little.
Okay.
I can't think of anything
Okay.
significant there.
What about, do you know how your parents met?
No.
No. Okay. But you were the first child and you were born then 2 years later in 25.
Right.
So by then, obviously, your parents had moved to Greenfield or moved to King City
Yes.
when they
Yes.
married.
Yes.
They moved to
Well,
King City.
actually, my father had lived there before they were married, and he was in this automobile business. How long, I don't remember.
Okay. So, do you have any real early recollections of your life as a child, say when you were between the ages of 1 and 5?
I have one very short memory of living in the house where we were as when I was an infant. I remember chasing a fly behind a curtain. I couldn't catch it. It was in the window, was trying to buzz out, and that I never did catch the fly, but I remember the incident.
That's amazing that all these years later you remember that.
Very significant.
Well, it was an important issue at the time, I think.
So does that mean there were a lot of flies in King City at the time, or just that one pesky one?
There was only one that I know of.
The one that got away.
Yeah.
Right.
Okay, so this was on North San Lorenzo.
Yes.
And do you know how long you lived on North San Lorenzo?
Yes. We left the house in town in 1927, I think in the fall of 1927.
So, okay, in 1927 you left the San Lorenzo house
Right.
and went to where?
We went out to the Spreckels Ranch. There were several leases out there, and we lived near the beet dump out there, and it was about 2 or 3 miles north of town on the Spreckels Road. And we were there for 3 years, raising sugar beets and dry beans.
How did your father go from the car dealership into the farming? Do you know that story?
I think it was, my father had been raised on a farm and was more or less familiar with agriculture, although it was different here. And I believe the way they started was Spreckels at one time, originally they used to farm the land themselves with crews that lived on the ranch, usually single men. They had like dormitories or bunkhouses and so forth. And I think they discontinued that practice in 1927 when they leased the land out to individual farmers. That's my understanding of it.
So, do you recall any of that, leaving the town of King City and going to the farmhouse out in Spreckels?
No, I don't
Okay.
remember the move.
Okay.
I remember the years that we lived on that first lease, which
Okay.
was 1927 to 1930.
Okay. And then what happened in, let's see, well, we're about at the stock market crash then, right? In 1929?
The stock market crashed in 1929.
You have any recollection of that?
No.
Okay. Didn't affect you as a child?
Well, it affected us all indirectly, but I wasn't aware of it at the time. At that early ages, I knew that we didn't have much money, but as a child, I didn't realize the significance of that because my parents, provided for us and we felt secure, and small children are really not aware of those larger issues.
So you say in 1930 then you made another move?
Yes.
And where was that to?
We moved to a ranch south, adjoining King City. The Spreckels used to call that the South Monte, and I don't know why, except that they had certain irrigation systems and with large pumping plants, and they called that pumping plant the South Monte pump, and that's where we moved to in 1930. And then my father and an uncle, who was a partner also, farmed that land just north of town and near the river.
So where was the South Monte Ranch in today's location? Could you describe it?
Well, it would be north of the cemetery and all the way to the river, and it followed some lines that were riverbanks, old riverbanks. There are several levels in the Salinas Valley, and I think they were originally riverbeds that changed courses and so forth. But that was a prominent feature there at that time. And the lease was, I think, almost 500 acres of irrigated land, and it was north of town, next to the river.
Okay. And it was called the South Monte Ranch.
Originally, yes.
And there was a house there?
There were several buildings there, one of which was a two-story bunkhouse. And I think it had been occupied for a little while by another family. It was a long two-story house, and my uncle and his family lived in one end of it, and we lived in the other end of it. There was a partition in the middle. But basically, we were living in a very primitive house for several years.
And what was your uncle's name?
Morris Thayer.
Morris Thayer.
Yes.
Okay. So he was your mother's brother?
Yes.
Okay. And he became a partner with your father?
Yes, they went into a partnership, I think, when they started farming in 1927.
Okay. So that was it still sugar beets and dry beans? that they-
Yes, at that time it was mostly that. Occasionally there were grain crops, not very often, and I think some alfalfa fields, but that was those were the predominant crops at that time.
Okay. All right. So how long were you there on the South Monte Ranch?
We were there, well, my father retired in 1970, but I continued on there until 1980. So between my father and I, we were there from 1930 to 1980.
Wow, that's a long time.
Yes.
50 years. And leasing that land the entire time from Spreckels?
Yes. Spreckels still owned the ranch, but during the latter part of that time, they had closed the refinery in the town of Spreckels up near Salinas. And from then on, we didn't raise sugar beets, but we were free to raise mostly vegetable crops, processing, fresh market and processing crops.
Okay, so in 1930, your father, along with his brother-in-law,
Yes.
did the farming on the South Monte Ranch.
Right.
And you lived there.
Yes.
Okay, so you must have started school about that time.
Yes, I think I started kindergarten, and I believe I was in the first kindergarten class in King City. It was introduced at, I think it
Wow.
was in it would have been in the middle of 1930, I think. And
Okay.
then we moved that fall to the other ranch, the South Monte Ranch. And then I continued through grade school and high school from that location.
Where was the grade school?
It was on the corner of Vanderhurst and I can't think of the name of that. It's just south of the City Hall.
Pearl.
Pearl. It was on the corner of Vanderhurst and Pearl.
And was it kindergarten through 8th grade there?
Yes, it was.
Okay. Do you have any recollection of your time there?
Oh, I remember a lot of things
Okay.
during that period of time.
What are some of your earliest memories? You remember the names of some of your teachers?
Oh, yes, I remember some. There was a Miss Cleese, Miss Woodworth, Miss Beebe, Miss Gould, Miss Wideline, and I think that's about it.
Do you have any memories of specific incidents or subjects that were particularly meaningful to you?
I can't think of anything that stands out. We had sort of a routine there. By ages, in the early ages, we attended shorter hours, and as we got older, we stayed longer. It was, I think, an ordinary grade school routine.
Do you recall the teachers being strict, or do you recall them being kind?
Each teacher has her own way of teaching. I think they were all very good teachers.
Okay.
Some of them were disciplinarians, but I thought they all did a good job.
Okay.
And we all behaved fairly well, I think.
Was there a physical education program that or sports
No, there was
program?
nothing organized that I can recall. We had recesses that we'd go out and play things, and I think there were some, baseball games and so forth that were loosely organized, I think, by the teachers, but there wasn't a physical education program per se.
Okay. So, do you recall how you got to school?
Because I had a younger brother and sister, and then we had these cousins that lived on the ranch also, we were usually taken to school sometimes by my mother or my aunt who lived there too. And because it was about, I don't know, mile or mile and a half, we were all taken to school. But as I got old enough, I would walk home because the younger kids were picked up, but I was on my own.
Were they picked up in a car?
Yes.
Okay, so by the 30s, your family had a car or a truck
Yes.
of some kind. Do you remember what kind of vehicle?
I think it was probably a Studebaker
I hope so.
for obvious reasons. But cars were pretty primitive at the time, and looking back, I can see that they were primitive. At the time, it was transportation, and that's the way everybody traveled.
So your mother or your father would drive you
Yes.
to school, and then sometimes you might walk home?
Right.
Or?
I think it was usually, depending on weather. In the wintertime, when it was wet, there was no farm work to do, and often my father or my uncle would take us into school. But my mother and my aunt both drove, so a lot of the times they did the driving.
So your aunt was Morris's wife?
Yes.
And what was her name?
Irma.
Irma.
Yeah.
IRMA?
Yes.
Morris and Irma. Okay, and they're the ones that shared the house with you?
Yes.
Okay. And then you said you went on to have a younger brother and sister?
Yes.
And what were their names?
Harold.
Harold was your brother.
Harold was my brother,
Okay.
and Marjorie was my sister.
Marjorie. And when were they born?
Harold was born in 1928,
Okay.
and Marjorie in 1930.
Okay. All right. And so I know you had told me that you had a long history with the community church
Yes.
in King City.
Yes.
And was that at the location on Vanderhurst,
Yes.
across from the city hall and by the school?
Yes.
That
That was the location.
did you attend that? Did your parents attend that church?
Yes.
Or?
We all attended that. I don't know when we started,
Uh-huh.
but from a very early age.
Okay.
It was a much smaller building than it ended up with. It was added onto several times. But the original building was there starting in the 1890s, I think it was.
So, did you go to Sunday school there? And were you baptized there, or do you remember anything about that?
We attended a Sunday school, and yes, I was baptized there probably in my 8 or 10 or 12 years old, something like that. And then we attended worship there. We're in that church for many years.
Do you remember that being a positive experience, or?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, it was a good, positive experience. We had lots of friends there, and it was an important part of our lives.
Now, was your teacher Miss Beebe? Was that the Miss Beebe that was Bud Ferguson's?
Yes. It was a family that had lived out in the Oasis district, and Miss Beebe was a teacher there for, I think, her lifetime, her working career. And she had other relatives that lived out there, the Bergeson family. Mrs. Bergeson was Miss Beebe's sister.
Oh.
That would have been Buddy Bergenson's mother.
Yes,
Was a sister to
Yes.
Mrs. Beebe, the teacher.
right.
Was Mrs. Beebe, the teacher, the one that was your tutor all
Yes,
those years?
She taught me how to read.
Okay.
She was there for a long time. She was a very good teacher.
Okay, and then did you say that City Hall was there at that time when
There
you were?
was a city hall there, but it's not the building that's there now.
Oh, but it was on the same lot.
It was on the same lot. The building was started as, it was the first school in King City,
Oh,
was
where-
that building.
Okay.
And I think it was in the late 30s that that original building was moved, and then the present City Hall was built.
You say the late 30s?
Mid to late 30s.
Okay. Do you know where it was moved to?
Where it was what?
Where it was moved to?
Yes, it was moved down onto South, well, I'm groping, Canal Street. There was a lot at the end of Vanderhurst, no, at the end of Division Street and Canal Street. And it was set up there, and it was used for a Boy Scout hall for a number of years. It's not there anymore, of course. Between the time it was a school and when it was moved, it was then the City Hall for a while.
Oh, so the
And
city.
it was, one part of it was the city library.
Oh, wow.
So the library and the City Hall were both in that original building for a period of time.
But when it was located on Division and Canal.
No, when it was
No.
on Vanderhurst.
Oh, when it was on
When it was on
Vanderhurst.
Vanderhurst.
Oh, okay.
After it had been used for the school, then the school was moved, the school was rebuilt over on the corner of, what did you say, Bassett and
No, Pearl.
Pearl Street, and where the school is yet. Of course, the
Oh.
buildings have changed, but after it had been converted from the school, then it was the library and the City Hall for a period of time. And then the new building also included the library and the City Hall
Mm-hmm.
for a long time.
Okay. So first it was a school, then it became City Hall and the library, and then it got moved.
Yes.
Okay. They moved it so they could construct the new one.
Yes.
Is that right?
Yes.
Okay. Okay. Do you remember the construction of the new?
Yes, I remember it. The reason I remember it was that we had Boy Scout meetings somewhere during that time, and in the summertime the days are long, and we, being curious about it, went over in the evening and played in there, which we weren't supposed to be, but I believe there's a basement that we explored.
Ah. In the
In the new-
existing, the
in the
new
new-
City Hall
in the
and
new
library.
construction.
Okay.
Right.
It was a basement, huh?
I'm not sure about that, but it
There is.
seems to be.
Oh, there
There
is.
is a basement,
Oh,
yes, there is.
okay.
But we thought the construction process was very interesting, so we watched it.
Do you
And-
remember approximately what year that was? How
No,
old?
it would have been the late 30s, but exact year I don't recall.
Late 30s. Okay. Now, you say you were a Boy Scout?
Yes, I was in Boy Scouts for
And-
a number of years.
Do you know who your Boy Scout leaders were?
I think there was a man by the name of Donald Baldwin and Byron Larson. And I believe Austin Hayes was active in that. There was an original troop, and then I think there was a division, and there were 2 troops.
So was that Boy Scouts a good experience for you?
Yes, it was. It
Okay.
was good. We did activities that I wouldn't have done otherwise. We had camp outs, and activities that were good for us, and it was a good experience. I think it probably either discontinued during the war years, during World War II, or at least for some reason I don't think I was a part of it after that.
So when you think back over your childhood, in your early years, do you have good memories, or do you?
Yes.
You do have good
Yes,
memories.
they were good memories.
King City, do you remember anything about the downtown area?
Yes, I remember quite a bit about the makeup of the downtown area. The Broadway was the main street, of course, and it was where most of the businesses were, and it was in the first few blocks from First Street on, well, to where the high school is now.
Okay.
And there were some residents on that street too. In the early days, I think there were homes built there, and later years the homes were moved out and it became more businesses, gas stations and stores and so forth.
Any in particular names that you remember of businesses downtown?
Yes, coming into town from the south, one of the landmarks was Beasley's El Camino Hotel. I think that was the name of it. I
Okay.
remember it, but I think it was the El Camino.
Okay.
And
On the corner of Broadway and
First.
First.
Yeah.
Okay.
and it's gone, of
Yeah.
course.
Did
now
you
it's-
know Mr. Beasley?
No, not personally.
Okay.
I recognized him on sight,
Okay.
but I didn't know him personally.
Okay.
And there were a lot of the old buildings on Broadway. There was a building, I think there were some small old hotels that had been built in the late 1800s or early 1900s. In the middle of the block between First and Second, there was an old hotel that I think it was called the Yates Hotel.
Okay.
And the Greyhound bus station was in the ground floor of that, and I think the hotel was on the second floor. The Greyhound bus had a very narrow alley that came through where they'd load and unload people at the Yates Hotel.
Okay.
That was the bus stop. And then in the next block, one of the features that I remember was, and I didn't realize what it was at the time, but it was an old livery stable. And it had a driveway through the middle, and then it had stalls on the side where the horses were kept. And it wasn't in use as the livery stable when I can remember it, but it was still in use. I think Tynan Lumber used it for a period of time to store lumber. And I believe that some of the ground floor near the street was used as offices of some kind, or a workspace of some kind.
And that would have been on the north side of Broadway.
Yes.
About halfway down?
Yes.
Did you ever go there or play there or run through?
No, it was, I'd walk by on the street and you could see through the building. There was a door on the front end on the street, and then there was a door out the back. And I don't think I was ever in that building, but you could see through it when the
Okay.
doors were opened on both ends.
Okay.
There were several other buildings. The one on the corner of First and Broadway, there were some brick buildings. I think one was a grocery store, and the name and the proprietor had changed over the years, but it had always been a grocery store, I believe. And then there was the next was a store that for a long time was a J.C. Penney store.
And which block would that have been on?
That was the second block, so it
Second
would be
block.
between 2nd Street and 3rd Street.
Okay. On the north side or the south side?
North side.
North side, okay.
Mhm.
So a little bit farther down from the livery stable, or closer to the railroad
No, it'd be
tracks?
farther, it would be farther from the railroad.
Okay, so keep going. Okay,
Yeah.
well, let's see if you can, in your mind, visualize going farther down Broadway. Can you remember
Heading
anything?
west,
Heading west, uh-huh.
In that second block, there was a restaurant. I think a man by the name of Conham, Harry Conham, I believe, had a restaurant there. And then there was a bank building on the corner. It used to be called Monterey County Bank. Later became Wells Fargo. And on the south side of that block, there was a gas station on the corner of 2nd and Broadway. And then some buildings in there that I don't recall. In about the middle of the block was the theater called the Real Joy Theater,
Okay.
and it was very popular with everyone.
Uh-huh. Do you
And then-
recall going to the Real Joy Theater?
Oh yes, many
Okay,
times.
Okay.
Oh, we didn't go very often because we were in the middle of a depression and
Okay.
money was not,
Mm-hmm.
we didn't have a lot. But then on the other corner, at the corner of 3rd and Broadway, there was another gas station. The town used to have a lot of gas stations right on Broadway
Mm-hmm.
because that was the highway at that time,
Mm-hmm.
before the freeway went in. So all traffic for Highway 101 went right down Broadway. Of course, there wasn't as much traffic, but there was still quite a bit to go through the middle of a town.
Mm-hmm.
And then in the next block, on the north side, there was a group of 3 stores, and I think it was basically all one building, but was divided into 3 different units. And I think they used to call it the HAF. And I can't
Right.
remember what I think it stood for the initials of Hamilton, and I can't recall who that was, and then I think there was a Falkenberg.
Really?
And the first unit going west was a hardware store, and it was run by a man by the name of, I forgot now what his name was, Carlson. And it was an old-time hardware store where you'd go in, and they had high shelves on both sides that went way up, and they had a ladder on a trolley, a track, to where the clerks, if the thing was, like 7, 8 feet, 9 feet up in the air, you had these bins, and they'd push this ladder on this track and go up there and find the nuts or bolts or whatever you wanted, nails. And it was a colorful hardware store.
And that was in the HAF building?
Yes.
Was it the one on the corner?
Yes, it was the one on the corner. Then the one in the middle.
Uh-huh.
These 3 units had interior doors between them, so you could go from one store into the other
Okay.
through those interior doors. And the middle one has been several different things. At one time it was a pharmacy, and I believe they had a soda fountain in that pharmacy.
Okay.
At one time it was a grocery store. I think a man by the name of Burns. There was a Burns family, and I believe they ran the grocery store. And then in the 3rd unit, it was a dry goods store, clothing and fabric and that sort of thing.
Mm-hmm.
And at one point, it was called Freeman's. I think there was a man by the name of Ralph Freeman and his wife that ran that. So those were the 3 stores in that building.
Mm-hmm.
And then one of the stores in that block that I was very fond of was Mrs. McGuire's ice cream parlor. And she made very good banana splits and milkshakes and things like that we enjoyed occasionally.
What do you remember? How far down the block that was, or it was one of
About
the
the middle of the block.
About the middle of the
On
block.
the north side.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
And farther down there was a a two-story hotel called the Vendome.
Okay.
And then I can't remember. Then there was a reinforced concrete building that I believe was originally, it's a smallish building, and I believe it was originally Dr. Brummel's office building. He was an elderly man when I remembered him. And I don't think he was actually practicing medicine anymore, but that had been his building. Later on, it was an ophthalmologist.
Dr. Winslow? Is
Dr.
that
Winslow.
Dr. Winslow's, huh? Okay. All right.
I believe he was an oculist. I'm not sure.
Was next to the Vendome, was there the
The restaurant.
the restaurant?
Yes. When I remember it first, it was called Sook's Tavern.
Sook's
S-U-K-S,
okay.
Sook's Tavern.
All right.
And I never knew who he was, but it was well known at that time. And he had a cook working for him, I believe, who was Kiefer.
Jerry Kiefer?
Jerry Kiefer. I believe he was originally the cook for Mr. Sook.
Ah.
And eventually the restaurant was his.
Uh-huh.
And he, I think at that time, remodeled it so the front was rather decorative, had kind of a timber, kind of a European front, and had murals on both of the outside and the inside. And it became a rather famous restaurant in King City.
Mm-hmm.
Later on, he moved out of that and he built a new restaurant along the freeway.
Mm-hmm.
And then to go down a little farther, there was a Richfield station, gas station on the corner of Vanderhurst and Broadway.
Yes.
And on the other side of that street, now from that, was another hotel, the name I've forgotten. And then there was a Sprouts Rights, which was a dime store.
Mm-hmm.
And I believe there was a vacant lot in there, maybe a kind of a parking lot. And then we come to the building that was an auto dealership, which is now Fairway Market. And then there was a meat market next. And it was there for a long time. And then I think the next building was, at one time it was the telephone office.
Oh, yes. So you're across the street now
Yes, and
on
I'm
the
going-
south side, and you're going
Yes,
back the
I'm
other
going
way.
back down the other
So
direction.
it's a telephone company, yeah.
Right, and
Okay.
then there was a building in there that, it was a Western store, Best Western, for a period of time. And then we'd be to the corner where there was either a brick or a concrete building that was, when I first remembered, it was called the Bank of America. It had originally been started by A.P. Giannini, who was an Italian immigrant, and the first bank was called the Bank of Italy.
Okay.
And the Bank of Italy later became the Bank of America.
Okay. And then is that the one that is now Bengard Agency?
Yes, it
okay.
is.
All right.
And
then,
an interesting little thing there, Mr. Giannini, who was the founder of the Bank of Italy, used to come around to all of the branches. His office was in San Francisco, but he used to go around to all the branches and visit them to actually supervise their operations. And there was sort of a back alley or parking lots through that block. And my father and his auto business were off that also. And Mr. Giannini used to come down and he'd walk around town, and my father, we used to run into him sometimes in that block. He had an interesting background. During the earthquake in San Francisco in 1906, to back up, he numbered his branch banks in the order in which they were established. And King City was the 15th one ever established.
Okay.
And in 1906, his original bank in San Francisco was hit by the earthquake and a lot of damage was done. And I've been told that he, in order to protect the gold reserves and so forth in the vault, he had hired or bought a produce wagon and loaded all of the valuables from the vault into that, and he piled a lot of produce, apples and bananas and potatoes and so forth, all over the top of this, and he drove the wagon south out of San Francisco to protect the gold supplies and all the valuable papers. I can't be sure that that's true, but I believe it is.
Huh. So you would have heard that from your father?
From the old timers there.
Oh, wow. Interesting. And that would have been when Mr. Giannini was the head of the Bank of Italy.
Yes.
Okay,
Yes.
before it became Bank of America.
In fact, when I was a child going to grade school, we used to have what we called Bank Day, where I think it was to teach children to save, to be frugal. And one day a week was Bank Day, and children all knew this, and if their parents could afford to do so, they'd send a little money, and each child had a bank account.
Really?
And I'll show you the bank passbooks that I have here yet.
That would be great.
And they say the Bank of Italy on them. And I remember, in fact, I have the books here, and some of the entries were like 3 cents, 5 cents, 25 cents. And then the bank would send a representative over to collect all of these. The teachers collected the money and accounted for it all. Then the bank representative came, picked up this accounting sheet and the money, and went back to the bank, where he entered these 3-cent or 5-cent deposits in each bank
Wow.
book. And think of all the work there was there for, $2 or $3. But at the end of several years, I had probably $6 or $8.
Wow.
I think it's rather interesting.
It is interesting.
That the bank would go to that effort to teach children to be saving.
So, but you didn't actually walk to the bank
No.
to deposit it. You just gave it to your teacher, and
Yes.
then it was accounted for.
Yes.
And then you were in exchange given the book to
Yes.
verify what your total was.
I don't know whether we had the books at that time, but eventually we got the books.
Okay. Okay.
Because
and,
the entries were made every week.
And this was with the Bank of Italy or the Bank of America, or?
Well, it was the Bank of Italy at that
Bank of
time.
Italy,
And then during
okay.
that period of time, it was, it converted either to the Bank of America. I don't know whether it was just a change of name or change of ownership.
Uh-huh.
But it became, during the 30s, someplace in the early 30s, I think it changed from Bank of Italy to Bank of America.
Now, it seems to me that a kind of catty corner from the Bank of Italy would have been the other bank. I think we
Yes,
talked
it's-
about that.
I think it was called the Monterey County Bank originally.
Monterey County Bank.
And it
yes.
became Wells Fargo. I believe that became Wells Fargo. And then they changed locations later.
Both of those are fairly substantial buildings that
Yes.
still stand in King City.
Right.
So Monterey County Bank. Okay. All right. Okay. All right. So were there a few more things that you remember if you continue going down the street?
Well, there were other businesses in the next block, well, between Vanderhurst and what's that
San
next?
Lorenzo.
San Lorenzo.
Uh-huh.
There was a, no, it'd be, there's a street in between that.
Oh,
It's
Russ, you're
Russ.
right. Yes, you're right, Russ.
There was a building that was built as a mortuary there in the middle of that block.
Okay.
And there was, next to it, in the same building, basically, was a furniture store.
Okay.
Next to that was a grocery store, the name of which I don't recall.
Okay.
And then, then there's, next to it was another garage, an auto shop that sold automobiles, repaired them. And then I think in the early days it was a vacant lot. And then going across the street and back toward the railroad, there was a dry cleaners and a laundry.
Mm-hmm.
And then there was a building that was a pharmacy. And next to that was the IOOF hall. The lodge used the upper floor. And the lower floors were commercial buildings. I don't remember what. Oh, there was an auto parts place in there at one time.
Was it the IOF Hall or was it the Masonic Lodge?
Oh, it was, yeah, it's Masonic Lodge.
I mean,
You're
it was
right.
always a Masonic Lodge, right?
Yes,
Okay.
yes.
All right. And that's been there a long time, that Masonic Lodge.
Yes, it has.
Okay. And then a little bit farther up is where right now we have the Napa Auto Parts, and that was an old car dealership too,
Yes,
wasn't
that
it?
was called, well, on the corner. I think there's something in between there. There was, I can't recall.
Yeah.
Was it the Melody Shop? Was that in there?
There was a Miladian Melody Shop, and there was a Miss Adams that had, I think she carried some women's clothing, and she had sold records, the old disc records, and had kind of a music store in there. And she was there for a long time. I don't remember what that building became after that. And then I think it was next to a big auto shop called Johnson's Garage.
Okay, that's what I was.
And it has converted now, I think, to an accounting office.
Right,
s-
exactly.
Maybe some other things in there
Yeah,
too.
Hayashi and Wayland, yeah.
Yeah, Napa.
Yeah.
So, okay, well, we're pretty close to our film time running out here, so I think we're gonna take a break, and maybe we'll look at some pictures of some old-time scenes
Yes,
of King
yes.
City, and then we'll continue another time to talk about what we'd really like to talk to you about is what you remember about King City High School and the early years of King City High School, and more about your farming experiences
Certainly.
and some of those types of things that are of interest to us.
Yeah, I think it's
So-
all very interesting.
It is. It's amazing what you remember. It's
Some
great.
of it might be a little fuzzy, and I could be wrong on some of it.
Okay, so I think we'll call it a
Give
day.
us the
That's
date and
it.
stuff again, Roberta.
Today is Sunday, January the 15th, 2012.